Your great-grandmother fed her 4 children plus 3 railroad boarders on dollar suppers in McDowell County, West Virginia, from 1963 to 1970, charging 75 cents a day for breakfast and dinner. Number 21 on this list ran her 13 cents a pound from the company store. Number 12 fed 3 children a hot breakfast for a nickel. Number 5 on this list was nothing but salt pork, flour, and milk, and it carried your grandfather through a double shift. None of these meals are forgotten because they failed. The interstate highway and the chain grocery just replaced the country store that carried the ingredients. These 30 suppers fed Appalachian families through coal strikes, hospital bills, and winters when the railroad bonus did not come. Subscribe, and we'll keep these coming. Here are the 30 forgotten dollar meals that kept 1960s Appalachian families full. Number 30. Soup beans with cornbread. In 1965, your great-grandmother's deep pot sat on the back of a coal stove in Mingo County and simmered from breakfast until supper. Pintos had been soaked the night before in cold well water, picked clean of stones at supper time by whichever child she could trust. Streak-o-lean from the smokehouse went in at first light, with a halved onion and a touch of pepper. The broth darkened to the color of strong tea over 4 quiet hours. Cornbread baked in your iron pan for the last 20 minutes, lard crackling around the rim. A bowl of beans, a wedge of pone crumbled in, a cup of sweet milk on the side. That was supper for a household of 6, made for under 15 cents a head. Your great-grandfather walked the 3 miles home from the cage, knowing exactly what would be waiting. The pot was always there. Number 29. Ham hock and pinto beans. The smell of hog and onion came up through the floorboards by 10 in the morning, and the rest of the holler stayed quiet until that smell drifted out the back door. A smoked hock from the fall hog had been wrapped in cloth and kept in the spring house, shaved off a piece every Sunday for the bean pot. Most years, the hock had not been bought from the meat counter at all, since the hog had come up from the barnyard the previous November. Beans cooked low for 3 quiet hours until the meat slid loose from the bone. The whole pot went out with a slice of pone and a tall glass of buttermilk. The same hock and bean pot had simmered on Buchanan County stoves through 3 coal strikes between 1949 and 1965, the recipe never written down once. Those who ate it as kids are 60 now. They still salt their cornbread the way she did. Number 28. Cathead biscuits with sawmill gravy. Your great-aunt in Wise County, Virginia, set out 3 biscuits at 5 each morning for the boarding house table. 6 men paid $1 a week to sleep on her enclosed porch and eat what she put down. The biscuits got their name from their size, each one as big as a tomcat's head, pulled apart by hand and never cut with a glass. White lily flour, lard worked in cold, buttermilk poured cool from the milk safe. Dough was patted out on a floured board and dropped in shaggy rounds onto a hot iron pan. Sawmill gravy went over them, made from sausage drippings, flour, milk, and black pepper, enough to make a grown man cough. The whole breakfast cost her 32 cents a head to set out in 1962. The men ate 9 biscuits between them and went out the kitchen door without speaking. The recipe had come over with her Scotch-Irish great-grandmother 2 generations before the railroad ever cut through the gap. The biscuits were always hot. Number 27. Fried apples with bacon. Stamen wine saps and June apples had been picked the previous fall by your great-uncle and stored in the cellar under a cloth. By February, they had wrinkled some, but a sharp knife took the skin off in long curls. 3 apples went into a skillet with 2 slices of fatty bacon and a spoonful of brown sugar. The bacon rendered slow, the apples soaked up the fat and the sugar, and they took on the color of dark honey. It was a Saturday breakfast served alongside fried eggs and cathead biscuits. The skillet went onto the supper table still smoking. Number 26. Wilted lettuce salad with hot bacon dressing. On a Friday afternoon in April, your grandmother cut a colander of tender leaf lettuce from the kitchen garden in Pike County, Kentucky. She crisped 2 slices of fat back in a skillet, poured the hot grease over the lettuce with a quick splash of cider vinegar and a spoon of sugar, and tossed it with sliced green onions. The lettuce went limp under the heat. It was served with cornbread and a slice of cold ham, and the whole supper for four cost 90 cents. The lettuce was free. The vinegar was a quarter for the bottle and lasted 6 months. And the same dressing technique had been a Pennsylvania Dutch tradition before her people ever crossed into the mountains in the 1840s. She made it every spring as long as her hands still worked. Her granddaughter still cuts hers the same way. Number 25. Salt pork gravy on biscuits. The salt pork came from a sack at Sears Roebuck, 3 pounds for $1.15, kept in a covered crock by the warming oven. A wife in a coal camp at Lynch, Kentucky, sliced 4 thin strips before dawn in 1963, fried them gold, and made a flour gravy in the drippings with milk poured cool. Your great-grandfather ate his standing up, his lunch bucket already packed, and walked to the cage with the taste of pork fat and pepper still on his tongue. The whole breakfast cost 23 cents. He went down for 9 hours on it, came up black, and ate the same thing the next morning. What most people forget about a coal camp breakfast is that it did not just feed a man. It told him somebody had been awake before him. Number 24. Tomato gravy on toast. Canned tomatoes were her own from August of 1967, 50-quart jars stacked in the cellar 2 shelves high, sealed with paraffin and a metal ring. By February, the green beans were gone and the corn was gone, and you reached for what was left. Your grandmother heated a pint jar in a saucepan with bacon grease, a spoon of flour, pepper, and a touch of brown sugar, and ladled it over toast. Breakfast for your 5 aunts and uncles, served with a pitcher of cold milk. The whole pan ran under 15 cents. They ate it because they had to. And the tomato gravy itself was an old Depression-era trick, the way you turned the last jar of summer into a hot Sunday breakfast in February. 40 years later, those same children ordered it from waitresses in Tennessee diners and called it the closest thing to home on the menu. Number 23. Apple stack cake. The cake had 6 thin layers, each baked on a pie tin in a wood oven, separated by spiced dried apples cooked down with sorghum and cinnamon. Jenny Wilson taught it to her daughters on Beech Mountain in North Carolina, and her daughters carried it into Tennessee and Kentucky in the 1930s. By 1965, your grandmother made it for funerals, weddings, and Christmas Eve. The cake had to sit covered in a dish towel for a full day, so the apple filling soaked through the layers. The flour cost a dime, the sorghum was traded for eggs, the dried apples were free from the September pickings. The whole cake came in under 45 cents and fed 22 people at a wake. Nobody ever wrote that recipe down. They watched. Number 22. Killed lettuce and onions. Pulling tender leaf lettuce from the garden in the cool of morning was the first chore. Greens were washed in a tin pan, torn rough into a wooden bowl. A handful of green onions on top, sliced thin, the white parts kept separate from the green for the look of the bowl. Then the bacon grease, scalding hot from the skillet, poured straight over the leaves. They hissed and sank under the heat. A little vinegar, a touch of brown sugar, a small shake of pepper, and the bowl went out warm with the bacon strips laid across the top. Leftover dressing was poured back over the leaves twice during the meal so the lettuce stayed slick. The bowl was usually empty before anyone reached for second cornbread. Number 21. Leather breeches green beans. Beans were strung in early September on white cotton thread, each pod threaded through the middle with a darning needle. The strings hung in the warm air of the kitchen by the window for 6 weeks until the beans rattled like dry bones. A length came down in February when your canned ones ran out. They were soaked overnight, simmered 4 hours with fat back, and they tasted nothing like a fresh bean. They tasted like fall. And the Sustainable Mountain Agriculture Center in Berea is still keeping 140 Appalachian bean varieties alive in seed banks today. The strings went back up empty, ready for next September. Number 20. Chicken and dumplings. Don't crowd the pot, your grandmother said, letting spoonfuls of dough drop onto the simmering broth a few seconds apart. The chicken was a yard bird that had stopped laying, killed Saturday morning behind the woodshed, plucked over a kettle of boiling water, and singed clean. By Sunday afternoon, it had simmered 3 hours with celery, an onion, a bay leaf, and a chicken back from the previous week. The dumplings were flour, lard, milk, and salt, dropped in for the last 15 minutes. The pot fed 8 people. The smell carried all the way down to the church next door, which is exactly what she wanted, because 3 of those Sunday seats were always for visitors. Leftovers went into a covered dish for Monday. Number 19. Cornmeal mush with molasses. An hour before sunrise, a mother in Wallace, Kentucky, set a pot of salted water on the stove and stirred cornmeal into it with a hickory paddle until it thickened. Half an hour of low heat, a slow, steady stir, and the mush settled into a pot the color of wet sand. She ladled it into bowls for 3 children, poured a slow stream of dark sorghum across the top, and added a splash of canned milk. Her children ate it at 5:30 before the school bus came down the road, and the warm mush sat in their stomachs through morning recess. Whatever was left got sliced cold and fried in lard for supper, and the Wallace, Kentucky one-room school stayed open until 1971, the kids carrying the same dinner pail their parents had carried. Number 18. Greasy beans with onion. The greasy bean was an heirloom variety. Families in Buchanan County kept the seed for generations, a pole bean with a smooth, shiny pod that turned glossy in the pot. Beans were strung up in July on the corner posts of the garden, picked tender in August, snapped at supper time while a child read aloud from a borrowed Reader's Digest. The beans went into the pot with a handful of new potatoes and a spoon of bacon grease, simmered an hour, and the broth came up the shade of dark gold. Salt at the end, never the beginning, because salt at the start kept the skins tough. The pot fed 5 for under 30 cents, and the leftovers always made breakfast. Greasy bean seed was kept in tobacco tins and traded across the Cumberland Gap from one farm to the next, sometimes for a dozen eggs and sometimes for nothing more than a handshake. The seeds came back from those tins every March. Number 17. Shucky beans with hog jowl. Drying half a bushel of cornfield beans on a back porch table in October was a 2-week job. Beans went on white cloth, turned twice a day, brought in fast if rain looked likely. By November, they rattled in the bag like seed corn. A handful was tipped into the pot with hog jowl from the smokehouse, simmered 5 long hours until the beans softened and the jowl pulled apart. The broth came out smoky and dark, the kind that needed nothing but cornbread. Shuckies were dried by hands that did not stop moving from May until the first frost, and the technique was Cherokee originally, taught to the early Scots-Irish settlers who had no idea how to keep beans through a holler winter without canning jars. Number 16. Hominy and side meat. Hominy was made from corn grown in the river bottom field behind the house, kernels soaked in a wood ash lye solution until the hulls slipped off. A barrel of it was put up every fall, and a quart jar lasted a Sunday supper. Side meat was fried in the iron pan until the rim crisped up, and the drippings were tipped straight into a separate skillet over the hominy. Black pepper went on at the end, plus a small drift of crumbled cornbread for the texture. It ate like pasta to people who had never tasted pasta. The hominy had been 3 weeks of October work, the lye made on the same back porch from oak ashes and rainwater. No part of the corn went to waste. Number 15. Apple butter on biscuits. The smell of apples and clove and brown sugar came up off a copper kettle out in the open yard from October dawn until October dark, stirred all day with a long-handled paddle hand cut from a hickory branch. Your kin in eastern Kentucky put up 40-quart jars in a single weekend, and the apple butter went onto biscuits, into pork roasts, onto cold ham sandwiches all winter. By February, a thick spread of apple butter on a hot cathead biscuit was breakfast, lunch packed in a tin pail, and a snack after school. The whole jar took a small bag of brown sugar and an afternoon of stirring. Number 14. Friday night soup beans, cornbread, and buttermilk. A miner's wife in a West Virginia coal hollow set the same supper on her table every Friday night for 19 years between 1962 and 1981. She started the beans Friday morning before the children left for the school bus. 2 cups of pintos picked over at supper time, soaked in cold well water in the same chipped enamel bowl her mother had passed her at the wedding in 1953. By 8 in the morning, the pot was on the cook stove with a piece of streak of lean from the smokehouse, a halved onion, and a small shake of pepper. She did not measure a thing. The beans simmered all day on low, and by 5 the broth was thick and dark and the meat had pulled apart. Cornbread went into the iron skillet at 5:15, the lard crackling at the edges, baked 20 minutes until the crown went the color of an autumn oak. She set it out with a pitcher of buttermilk just up from the spring house, cold enough to fog the glass. Friday night was payday at the mine, and her husband came home from a 6-day shift with $38 in his pocket and coal dust still in the lines of his hands. He washed at the porch basin, sat at the head of the supper, and tore a slice of pone into the bowl of beans the way his father had done in Buchanan County a generation earlier. The buttermilk went into the bowl on top. He ate 2 helpings without speaking. It cost her 98 cents to feed him, 2 children, and herself, and the leftovers went out to the spring house for Saturday breakfast. A P. Carter's biographer wrote that the Carter family of Maces Spring, Virginia, ate the same Friday supper every week for 30 straight years, and black coal camp cooks in Lynch, Kentucky, were eating the same beans and pone the same Friday night, and so were the black families in Wallace, Kentucky, 3 hollers over. The food was the language poverty spoke in common across the fence. The Black Lung Act passed Congress in December of 1969, and 3 weeks later her husband applied. Friday night supper did not change. The beans rose from the same pot, the same way the next week. Number 13. Sweet potato pie. The sweet potatoes were dug in October from a clay bank patch behind the house, cured in the smokehouse for 2 weeks until the skins turned papery and the flesh sweetened. 3 of them went into a deep pot of water to boil for 40 minutes. Your grandmother in the Cumberland hollers mashed them with a fork, added 2 eggs from her own hens, a cup of canned milk, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a spoon of vanilla extract bought at Rose's for a dime. The crust was lard and flour, rolled thin on a floured tablecloth and crimped at the edges with the tines of a fork. The pie baked an hour in a wood oven, the kitchen warm enough to fog the glass. It came up the shade of an autumn sunset, served warm with whipped cream from the cow. A whole pie cost 35 cents and fed 8 at a 1966 church social. The plate came home empty. Number 12. Hoe cakes with sorghum. Mixing a small dipper of cornmeal, a touch of salt, and just enough buttermilk to make a thick batter took less than a minute. 4 flat rounds were dropped onto a hot iron griddle, lard sizzling around the edges, and flipped with a knife when the bottoms took on the color of pecan shells. Hoe cakes went onto a tin plate with a small pitcher of dark sorghum on the side, the kind made at the molasses stir-off in late September. Children poured the sorghum themselves, dragging the cake through the dark sweetness until the plate was clean. The molasses had been traded for 2 dozen eggs. Number 11. Buckwheat cakes with country ham. Stirring buckwheat flour into a stoneware bowl of warm water, salt, and a pinch of sourdough starter the night before set the cakes for morning. By dawn, the batter had a frothy crown and a slightly tangy smell. The batter was ladled onto a hot griddle in 8-inch rounds, flipped once and stacked on a warm plate. A slice of dry-cured country ham went on the side, browned in its own fat, salty enough that it ate like a meal in itself. The cakes soaked up the ham drippings with a slow drizzle of sorghum across the top of the stack. The buckwheat had been bought from the grist mill in a 5-pound sack the autumn before. The ham was the Christmas hog. The same breakfast went into the lunch buckets carried to the cage, wrapped in waxed paper. Number 10. Pole bean soup with potatoes. A mason jar of half-runner beans, put up in August on a hot kitchen Saturday, came down off the cellar shelf in February. Your grandmother in Wise County, Virginia, poured the whole jar into a pot, added 2 diced new potatoes, half an onion, a piece of fatback, salt, and pepper. The pot went on at 4 o'clock and simmered an hour, the broth thickening as the potatoes broke down. She crumbled cornbread into the bowls before she ladled in the soup, the way she had been taught at her mother's elbow. A household of 6 ate it for Friday supper, and there was enough left over for Saturday breakfast. The beans had cost 10 cents in ball jar lids the previous summer. The potatoes came up from her own root cellar where they kept all winter under straw. Number 9. poke salad with bacon grease. Shoots came up in May along the fence rows and creek banks. The tender ones were less than 6 inches tall, picked before the leaves turned reddish at the edges. Greens had to be boiled twice in fresh water to draw the bitterness out, drained both times. Only then could they go into a hot pan with bacon grease and a spoon of vinegar. They came out dark and silky and a little smoky. The whole skillet rose out of the pan with the smell of fried fat and wild greens. Nothing else needed to be added. Knowing which leaves were safe and which would put a child sick in bed was the whole skill, learned by every holler child before they could read. Number 8. Ramps and eggs. The smell of ramps came up out of the iron skillet in a smoke that went through the whole house and out the open door into the holler. Your great-uncle in the eastern Kentucky hills dug a sack of them every April from a north-facing slope above his own cabin, washed the dirt off in the creek, and brought them home for breakfast. His wife sliced 8 bulbs thin into bacon grease, cracked 4 eggs over them when the ramps were soft, and folded the whole skillet onto 2 plates with pone on the side. 4 people ate breakfast on what had been pulled from the hillside that morning. The ramps had come up from the same slope his grandfather had dug, and Richwood, West Virginia has been throwing a ramp dinner festival every April since 1937. The cookhouse churning out 3,000 pounds of ramps in a single weekend. A neighbor a half-mile down the road was eating the same breakfast at the same hour. Number 7. Cornbread crumbled in milk. "Crumble it small," your grandmother said, breaking a wedge of leftover cornbread into a tall glass of cold buttermilk on a hot July evening. Supper had been hours earlier. A child came back from playing in the creek, hungry and tired. A glass of milk and a slice of pone, broken up small, eaten with a long iron spoon, was supper number 2 on a summer night when no fire had to be lit again. It cost a nickel. The buttermilk had come up from the spring house that morning, the cool kept by spring water flowing across stone. The pone was a half-day old, just dry enough to soak the milk without falling apart. Children ate it on the back porch with the lightning bugs coming up from the grass, and they remembered it the way other children remembered ice cream. Number 6. Fried potatoes with onions. The potatoes came from a 100-pound burlap sack stored in the cool dark of the cellar. Your great-aunt in Buchanan County, Virginia, sliced 6 thin, peeled and all, tipping them into hot bacon grease in a heavy iron pan with a sliced onion on top. She covered the pan with a lid for 10 minutes, lifted it, turned the potatoes once with a metal spatula, and let them brown for 10 more. Salt and pepper at the end. A heaping plate fed her, 2 grandchildren, and a boarder. The sack had been hauled in from the farm in October. The onion had come up from her own row. But the cast iron skillet was her mother's, and her mother's before that. Number 5. Liver mush sandwich. In November, after the hog had been cut and the hams hung, the liver and the trimmings went into a separate pot with cornmeal, salt, sage, and a heavy hand of black pepper. Your kin in Wise County, Virginia, simmered it 3 hours, packed it into breadloaf pans lined with cloth, and let it set on the cellar floor overnight. By Tuesday, a slice came out, fried crisp on both sides in bacon grease, and slid between 2 pieces of light bread with a smear of mustard. Your grandfather ate it cold at noon, 400 feet underground, and it cost 12 cents to pack the sandwich. The whole hog had set them back $15 in November, and it fed them until Easter. And the recipe was an Appalachian variation on Pennsylvania scrapple, brought down the spine of the mountains by German settlers a century before. Number 4. Crackling bread. Rendering the leaf lard from a fall hog in a black kettle outside the kitchen door took a full day. Cracklings were what was left when the lard was strained off, dark, crisp pieces of skin and meat the size of acorns. Your grandmother in southeastern Kentucky mixed 2 cups of cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, salt, and a heaping cup of cracklings into a stiff batter, tipped it into a hot iron skillet greased with the lard, and slid it into a wood oven for 30 minutes. The bread came out heavy and rich, the cracklings flecked through it like nuts. A wedge with a tall glass of buttermilk fed her for supper, and she baked one every week through the winter, the smell pulling neighbors over the fence to ask what was in the oven. Number 3. Brown beans and fried potatoes. The combination was as old as Appalachia. A pot of brown beans, simmered all day with a piece of fat back. A skillet of potatoes fried crisp at the last minute in bacon grease and onion. Cornbread to mop the bean juice. A glass of fresh whole milk to wash it down. The potatoes had to hit the skillet at the very last minute, or the crisp went out of them. She timed it to the screen door slamming shut. My uncle still asks for it the same way. Beans first, potatoes alongside, never on top. Number 2. Salt-rising bread with apple butter. The starter had lived in the same crock since 1947, fed with cornmeal and warm water every Friday night, never once thrown out, even after the 1968 cookstove fire scorched the rim black. It was cornmeal, milk, and warm water, set in a covered crock on top of the warming oven overnight. By morning, it had a sharp, cheesy smell and a frothy head. The bread was mixed and proofed 3 more times, baked in 2 black loaf pans for an hour. A thick slice came up the shade of cream, dense as cake, and a heavy spread of apple butter went on top. A miner ate 2 slices at 4:30 in the morning. The flour came from a paper sack the company store delivered every other Friday. A loaf lasted 3 days. The same starter had also pulled the family through the 1957 Tug Fork flood, fished out of the back of the kitchen the morning after the water went down. Number 1. Coffee soup with leftover biscuits. The smell of strong percolator coffee filled the 4-room house at 5:15 every morning. Your great-grandmother poured a cup, hot and black, into a deep bowl and crumbled half a leftover cat head biscuit right into the coffee. A spoon of sugar went on top, a slow drizzle of canned milk, and the contents of the bowl softened into something between bread pudding and breakfast soup. A child ate it before the school bus came at 6:30, and your grandfather ate it after the night shift at 6:15. It cost 3 cents a bowl, sugar included. The coffee was 8 o'clock from the A&P, 89 cents a pound, ground at the store. The biscuit was already paid for. 3 generations of children in that holler grew up calling it breakfast, and not one of them ever saw a bowl of cereal until they got married. The same bowl had been on her own grandmother's table during the Great Depression, with chicory mixed in when the coffee ran short. Apple butter was patience in a pot, the slow rhythm of autumn preserved for the long winter ahead. Apples were peeled, cored, and cooked down for hours in large copper kettles, stirred with long wooden paddles to keep them from burning. Sugar, cinnamon, and cloves were added little by little, their scent filling the home and drifting out through open windows. It was an all-day affair. One person adding wood to the stove, another tasting, another stirring, the laughter and chatter making the wait feel shorter. As it thickened, the apples transformed into something dark, glossy, and smooth as silk. When finally ready, it was poured into jars and sealed, each one holding a season's worth of sweetness and effort. In winter, it was spread over bread or biscuits, a taste of sunshine when snow lay heavy on the ground. Apple butter wasn't just food. It was a promise that even when the world turned cold, warmth could be found in a jar, born from patience and love. Number 24. Bread and milk. A bowl. A few slices of day-old white bread torn into rough pieces, warm milk poured over the top, and sometimes a pinch of sugar. That was supper. In rural homes across Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Ozarks of Arkansas, this was the meal that showed up when the week hadn't finished, but the money had run out. The bread swelled soft in the warm milk, turning the bowl into something almost custard-like if you gave it 2 minutes to sit. A loaf of bread cost 16 cents in 1952. A half-gallon of milk was 43 cents. For a family of 5, that is dinner for under 60 cents. No stove required, no pots to wash. Old-timers across the southern mountains still eat bread and milk before bed, the way their grandmothers did back then, not because they have to, because it tastes like the safest night of their childhood. Bacon grease jar cooking was more than a habit. It was a household tradition passed down through generations. After cooking bacon, no one ever threw out the grease. It was poured into a tin can, jar, or ceramic container and kept right on the stove or in the fridge, ready to use in just about everything. This rendered fat added smoky, savory depth to greens, eggs, cornbread, gravies, and even biscuits. For families on a budget, it was a goldmine of flavor that cost nothing extra. Some cooks would use it to start soups and stews, others to fry potatoes or season beans. A little bacon fat could turn the most humble vegetable into a side dish worth remembering. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 50s often listed bacon drippings as a key ingredient, not just a substitution. And when butter or lard was hard to find during wartime rationing, bacon grease picked up the slack with ease. It was efficient, it was tasty, and it felt like a little act of defiance, taking a scrap and making something wonderful with it. Even today, some home kitchens still keep a jar on the back burner, because good flavor never goes out of style. Poor man's steak was the working family's answer to Sunday dinner when real steak was out of reach. Ground beef or leftover scraps were shaped into patties, seasoned simply, and baked in a rich homemade gravy until tender. The edges browned beautifully, the gravy thickened to silk, and the smell filled the whole house. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered noodles, it was hearty enough to fool anyone into thinking it was a feast. The secret was slow cooking and care, two things that cost nothing but made everything better. Each bite carried the taste of home, of making do and making it good. Poor man's steak wasn't about imitation, it was about pride. It proved that with time, patience, and love, even the humblest meal could taste like abundance. Number 19. Egg in a hole, a slice of bread, a circle cut from the center, butter in the skillet. The bread went in, then the egg cracked directly into the hole, and the whole thing cooked together until the white set and the edges of the bread turned golden and crisp. It had a dozen names depending on where you lived. Egg in a basket, egg in a frame, toad in a hole. In working-class neighborhoods across Pittsburgh and Cleveland, kids called it a bullseye egg. One egg cost about 8 cents in 1954. One slice of bread was a cent. That is breakfast for 9 cents. For a woman feeding 5 children before school, this wasn't a recipe. It was math. Every scrap got used. The bread circle you cut out got fried in the same butter and eaten right alongside the main piece. Nothing was wasted. Not ever. That was the rule in those houses back then, and it was not a rule anyone wrote down. Breadcrumb stretchers were one of the oldest tricks in the frugal cook's playbook, and there's a reason they stuck around. The idea was simple but clever. When you didn't have enough meat to go around, bulk it up with breadcrumbs, or crushed cereal, oats, or even cracker dust. Suddenly, a single pound of beef became enough for 6 patties or a whole loaf. Old cookbooks from the 1930s through the 1970s had full sections devoted to stretchers, with ratios and substitutions depending on what you had on hand. The beauty of breadcrumbs was that they were essentially free, made from stale bread or saved scraps no one would eat anyway. When seasoned well and mixed with an egg or two, they helped hold everything together, add texture, and absorb flavor like a sponge. Meatballs, meatloaf, hamburger patties, even stuffed peppers relied on this trick to get by. This wasn't just about saving money, it was about survival with dignity. Families were able to enjoy their favorite meals without feeling the sting of scarcity quite so sharply. In a way, breadcrumb stretchers were the unsung heroes of wartime and Depression-era cooking, quietly making dinner possible, one crumb at a time. Pickled red beets and eggs brought color and tang to even the plainest tables, their ruby hue shining through glass jars on pantry shelves. The process began with beets simmered in vinegar, sugar, and warm spices like cloves or allspice until tender and fragrant. Hard-boiled eggs were peeled and dropped into the hot brine, soaking up its jewel-toned color day by day. By the 3rd day, the eggs had turned a deep pink, the whites glowing like stained glass, and the flavor had deepened to a perfect balance of sweet and sour. They were served beside stews, sandwiches, or slices of fresh bread, each bite adding brightness to the meal. The beets themselves were sweet and earthy, their tang waking up tired winter palates. This was food made to last, stretching freshness into months of color and flavor. Every Amish kitchen had a jar waiting on the shelf, a cheerful reminder that beauty could be bottled from thrift. Pickled red beets and eggs were more than a side dish. They were an act of artful survival. joy preserved through patience and care. Meatless gravy with drippings was one of those flavor-saving secrets every thrifty cook swore by. When meat was scarce, but flavor was still essential, the pan drippings left behind after cooking even a small piece of meat became pure treasure. A few tablespoons of fat, a sprinkle of flour, and a bit of water or broth was all it took to whip up a rich, velvety sauce. This gravy didn't need chunks of meat. It carried the essence of it, thanks to the browned bits and rendered fat that clung to the bottom of every skillet. In many households, meatless gravy showed up more often than actual meat, poured over potatoes, toast, rice, or biscuits to give a little something extra to otherwise plain staples. Some added herbs or a splash of vinegar for zing. Others stirred in canned mushrooms or onions to mimic texture and body. It was a dish built entirely out of scraps and instinct, and it brought comfort when comfort was in short supply. If someone managed to get a hold of real broth, they'd stretch it with drippings to double the yield. It wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying, and that made all the difference. Chicken corn soup was the soup of every season, simple but full of heart. It began with bones saved from Sunday's roast, simmered slowly until the broth turned golden and rich. Sweet corn and diced potatoes were added next, filling the pot with sweetness and comfort. Homemade noodles, rolled thin, cut by hand, and dusted with flour, gave it body and soul. The smell of simmering broth drifted through open windows, calling family to the table long before it was ready. It was a dish built on thrift and memory, proof that nothing from the farm ever went to waste. Each spoonful was soft and soothing, a taste of warmth and wisdom passed down through generations. Chicken corn soup was nourishment for body and spirit alike. Number 17. Peanut butter and crackers. Not a sandwich. A sleeve of saltines and a jar of peanut butter, and the cracker you spread thick with a butter knife and ate standing over the kitchen sink at 3 in the afternoon, when breakfast was a long way off and supper hadn't started yet. A jar of peanut butter cost 22 cents in 1951. A box of saltines was a dime. In the coal mining communities of southern West Virginia, peanut butter and crackers went into lunch pails alongside thermoses of black coffee every single morning. In farmhouses across Ohio and Michigan, it was what children ate between school and chores. Simple, cheap. It filled you and kept you going for hours on not much money. Decades later, people who ate this as kids still reach for it without thinking. That is not nostalgia. That is the way your body remembers what actually worked. Cabbage stretch soup was more than just a recipe. It was a lifeline in a pot. In times when meat was rare and vegetables limited, cabbage became the star of the soup pot. Shredded thin and simmered with water, onion, and maybe a little broth if you were lucky. It created a warm, hearty base that could feed a family for pennies. Sometimes potatoes, carrots, or bits of pasta were added to bulk it up, but cabbage was always the anchor. It had the advantage of being cheap, easy to grow, and surprisingly filling. The best part? You didn't need much else. The longer it cooked, the sweeter and more tender it became, soaking up any seasoning you threw its way. Old cookbooks and wartime manuals often included cabbage soup under sustaining meals, or meatless mains, emphasizing its value for both health and economy. Some versions were inspired by European immigrants who had long relied on cabbage in their home cooking. It's not fancy. It doesn't pretend to be. But cabbage soup meant something back then. It meant warmth on cold nights, a meal that could stretch to feed everyone, and the quiet triumph of making something out of almost nothing. Potato donuts were the sweet surprise of thrift, soft and golden rings born from yesterday's mashed potatoes. The dough came together with flour, sugar, milk, and a touch of yeast or baking powder, rising slow under clean cloths as the kitchen filled with the quiet promise of sweetness. When the time was right, mothers rolled out the dough and cut circles by hand, saving the centers for smaller treats. The sizzling oil filled the air with warmth, the sound of bubbles and frying dough like music on a cold morning. Each donut puffed up light, the mashed potatoes keeping them tender long after cooling. Once lifted from the pan, they were dusted with sugar or dipped in a simple glaze made from milk and vanilla. Children waited eagerly, fingers dusted white before the first bite. These donuts didn't need fancy tools or rich ingredients. They were built from patience and care. They turned leftovers into joy, turning a quiet morning into a moment of sweetness. Even after days of hard labor and thrift, potato donuts made life taste soft again, reminding families that small miracles could rise from even the most humble kitchens. Number 23. Lard sandwich. 2 slices of white bread, a thick spread of lard, salt. That was all. In Depression-era Iowa and the wheat-farming counties of eastern Kansas, lard sandwiches were packed into lunch pails for men heading to fields that wouldn't pay until harvest. Lard cost 8 cents a pound in 1950. A 10-pound can lasted a family 2 weeks, stretched across biscuits, pie crusts, and skillets in ways your grandmother understood and modern cookbooks have never figured out. Children in rural Oklahoma carried them to school wrapped in wax paper. They didn't call it a lard sandwich. They called it a sandwich. The word in front of it was understood and left unspoken. Some families added a smear of sorghum molasses to cut the fat. Others pressed a thin slice of raw onion into it. It filled you. It kept you working. That was the whole point. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers is the kind of recipe that sounds like a joke until you try it. This Depression-era dessert was born when apples were either too expensive or too hard to come by, but families still wanted something sweet to finish off the day. Enter the Ritz cracker, a salty, buttery, flaky little miracle that, when soaked in sugar syrup and lemon juice, somehow started to taste like baked apples. Cookbooks from the 1930s described the recipe as appleless apple pie, and you could find it in community recipe cards all the way through the 1970s. The crackers were layered inside a crust and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. The filling baked down into a warm, sticky, and surprisingly convincing substitute for the real thing. If someone didn't tell you, you probably would never know. What made this dish so genius was how it turned an ordinary pantry staple into a dessert that felt luxurious in a time when luxuries were few and far between. People would gather around the table, pass around the pie, and pretend it was made with fresh-picked fruit from a local orchard, and honestly, most didn't mind the difference one bit. Rivel soup was the kind of meal that came from nothing and somehow became everything. A pot of chicken broth simmered slow while hands worked flour and egg into tiny, irregular dough crumbs called rivels. These humble bits were dropped into the bubbling broth, puffing up into soft, chewy morsels that turned simple broth into something hearty and complete. Sometimes leftover vegetables, carrots, celery, or onions, were stirred in for extra depth, but the rivels always stole the spotlight. The steam rose gently from the pot, carrying the scent of home and hope. It was food for long winters and weary bodies, the kind that filled more than just the stomach. No 2 batches were ever exactly the same, but that was the charm. Each bowl told its own story of improvisation and care. For the Amish, Rivel soup represented the art of making do and doing it well, the quiet pride of turning scarcity into satisfaction. It was humble food that asked for little and gave much, a bowl full of comfort born from the simplest of hands. Number 18. Stewed tomatoes and rice. A can of whole tomatoes, a cup of long-grain white rice, a little salt, and a bay leaf when the house had one. The tomatoes cooked down with the rice until everything absorbed together into something thick and tangy and deeply warm. In rural Louisiana parishes and the coastal counties of Georgia, stewed tomatoes and rice was Friday supper in Catholic households that could not afford fish but could not eat meat on Friday either. A can of whole tomatoes was 11 cents in 1955. A pound of rice was 20 cents. That is a hot meal for under 30 cents. If you grew up eating this, the smell is still in your memory, warm and sharp and simple, like safe ground under your feet. Think about what it took to put this on the table every Friday night, year after year, without complaint and without recognition. There was no recipe card because no recipe was needed. There was no timer because the cook knew by the steam when the rice was done. The women who made stewed tomatoes and rice for their families did not receive credit in any history book. They were not paid for the hours they stood at the stove. They did not receive a thank you most nights. They received empty bowls and children who went to bed full. In the farming communities of the Deep South and the coastal lowlands, this is how entire generations were fed, quietly, cheaply, by women who understood that a 30-cent pot of stewed rice and tomatoes made with care was indistinguishable from love. Stale bread pudding was the kind of dessert that felt like a miracle. You started with scraps, slices of old, hard bread that no one wanted to eat, and somehow turned them into something soft, sweet, and deeply satisfying. The recipe was simple. Soak the bread in milk, add a little sugar and cinnamon, crack in an egg or two, and bake until golden and custardy. The result was a warm, gooey pudding that felt far richer than the ingredients would suggest. For families with tight grocery budgets, this was a way to avoid waste and still have something sweet at the end of the day. In some variations, raisins or chopped apples were added when available. Others poured syrup or canned fruit over the top for a little flair. No matter how it was made, it was always a dish rooted in resourcefulness. Cookbooks from the 1940s practically sang its praises, and community recipe swaps often featured a dozen different versions. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a lesson in creativity, frugality, and the magic of making do. And if you ask anyone who grew up eating it, they'll probably say it still tastes like love. Amish cabbage casserole was the food of quiet evenings, hearty, wholesome, and meant to fill more than just hunger. Layers of chopped cabbage, rice, and ground beef came together under a creamy sauce made from milk, butter, and flour, baked until tender and bubbling. The cabbage softened to sweetness, the rice absorbed every bit of savory richness, and the beef gave it substance. The smell drifted through the home, cozy and familiar, wrapping around every room like a blanket. Sometimes cheese was added on top for a golden crust, but it didn't need it to feel complete. This was the kind of dish that waited patiently in the oven while chores were finished or prayers were said. It wasn't fancy, but it carried warmth in every bite, the kind of warmth that lingered long after the plates were cleared. For the Amish, this casserole was more than sustenance. It was a gesture of care, proof that even simple food could feel abundant. Every spoonful spoke of gratitude, of hands that worked and hearts that shared. Amish cabbage casserole was comfort, thrift, and togetherness baked into one perfect dish. Number 20. Macaroni and tomatoes. A box of elbow macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and sometimes a pinch of sugar. That is dinner. The tomatoes and the pasta cooked together in one pot, the macaroni absorbing the tomato brine until it went soft and orange and thick. In the rural South, particularly across Alabama and Mississippi, this was a Depression-era staple that never quite left the table. Families in Appalachian coal towns added a splash of milk to make it creamier. Farm wives in Georgia made it with fresh tomatoes in summer and switched to canned in winter without changing a single thing. A box of macaroni was 11 cents in 1953. A can of stewed tomatoes was a dime. Dinner for 6 for under 25 cents. If you grew up eating this, the taste is still in your memory right now. Warm and sharp and just slightly sweet, like summer in a bowl. Ham and bean soup was the meal that carried families through long winters, slow-cooked on wood stoves that warmed both hands and hearts. A single ham bone saved from Sunday dinner was enough to flavor a whole pot of white beans, onions, and carrots. Sometimes celery or garlic found its way in, if the garden had any left to give. The beans simmered for hours until soft, thickening the broth naturally, while the meat fell from the bone in tender shreds. The smell filled every room, a mix of smoke, salt, and comfort that promised fullness. It was eaten with bread or cornbread, ladled into deep bowls that steamed in the cold air. Leftovers were even better the next day, richer and heartier after sitting overnight. For the Amish, this soup was more than a recipe. It was a rhythm of life. It spoke of thrift, patience, and gratitude for every bit of nourishment the earth and table provided. Ham and bean soup reminded everyone that love could be boiled down, shared, and still keep giving. Number 25. Water gravy on toast. When there wasn't any milk, butter, or meat in the house, There was still flour, water, and the drippings stuck to the bottom of the skillet from the night before. Your mother scraped those drippings loose with a wooden spoon, sprinkled flour in and stirred until it browned, then poured in water and worked it until a pale, thin gravy formed. She poured it over toast and set the plate in front of you. In the mill towns of the Piedmont and the mining camps of eastern Kentucky, water gravy was the meal that appeared on the last night before payday. It didn't have a name in most households. Families just called it gravy and bread because naming it would have made it real. Would have meant admitting out loud that the cupboard was empty. A tablespoon of bacon grease made it taste richer than it had any right to be. One skillet, 5 minutes, a handful of flour, and your family could go to bed with something warm inside them. That was enough. Potato peel broth was one of those quiet genius ideas that made the most out of the bare minimum. You had potato skins piling up on the counter, and instead of tossing them out, cooks would throw them into a pot of water, maybe with an onion skin or two, and simmer it down into a golden, earthy broth. It may not sound like much today, but back then it was practically liquid gold. Rich in nutrients and surprisingly flavorful, it served as the base for soups, stews, or even gravy. Old cookbooks were filled with reminders to never waste a peel, and this was the perfect example of why. In times when every cent and calorie counted, this broth delivered on both. You could salt it lightly, strain it, and store it for later, and no one would bat an eye if it was used more than once for multiple meals. The broth could also be thickened with flour or mashed potatoes to create something heartier, especially when meat wasn't on the menu. When families had more mouths than money, this was one of the smartest ways to stretch a sack of potatoes into several meals. A humble peel became a warm, nourishing bowl of comfort. Shoe fly pie was the sweetheart of the Amish kitchen, proof that even the simplest pantry could create something extraordinary. Made from nothing more than molasses, flour, sugar, and hot water, this pie was rich in flavor but humble in origin. The crust was rolled by hand, filled with a sticky, sweet syrup that bubbled up through the crumb topping as it baked. The smell alone, warm molasses, toasted sugar, and butter, was enough to draw every child to the table before it even cooled. It was born in lean times when every ingredient mattered and nothing could be wasted. The pie was both dessert and memory, a reflection of life itself, plain, honest, and deeply satisfying. Served with coffee in the morning or cream after supper, it represented comfort that money could not buy. Shoofly pie was more than sweetness. It was a reminder that resourcefulness could taste like luxury when made with love. Number 21. Fried potatoes and onions. A cast iron skillet, bacon drippings, 3 or 4 potatoes sliced thin, half an onion, salt, pepper, and thyme. Your mother didn't measure anything. She had made this so many times her hands knew what to do before her mind caught up. The potatoes went in first, the onions second, and the whole pan sat over medium heat until everything browned in layers and the kitchen smelled like something worth sitting down for. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 53 cents in 1952. In farm communities across Missouri and Indiana, fried potatoes and onions was not a side dish. It was the meal. A woman from a tobacco farm outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, once said that her family ate fried potatoes for supper 4 nights a week for 15 years and never once complained. You probably remember this. Maybe your family called it something different. The dish didn't need a name. It needed a skillet and 20 minutes. Eggless mayonnaise substitute was a lifesaver when rationing hit hard and eggs disappeared from pantry shelves. Homemakers got creative, crafting sandwich spreads and dressings without a single yolk. The secret was evaporated milk, mixed with vinegar or lemon juice, mustard, and a touch of oil. The acid thickened the milk into something creamy and tangy, surprisingly close to the real deal. This makeshift mayo showed up in potato salads, slaws, sandwiches, and deviled egg imposters alike. Wartime cookbooks often included multiple versions, each with different ratios or seasonings, depending on what was available. Some added sugar or paprika, while others leaned savory with onion powder and garlic. It wasn't about perfect replication. It was about good enough flavor when options were scarce. This DIY condiment not only stretched your supplies, but also kept familiar dishes on the table, boosting morale when meals were otherwise bare bones. And for families trying to create something resembling a normal lunch, that made all the difference. It's one of those small, clever tricks that helped people hold on to their routines and their dignity when the world around them was anything but predictable. Corn fritters were the taste of late summer joy, a golden mix of sweetness and savor born straight from the garden. Kernels were cut fresh from the cob, their milk thick and sweet, then stirred into a batter of flour, eggs, and a touch of sugar. The mixture was dropped into hot oil or butter, frying until crisp at the edges and tender within. The scent filled the kitchen with warmth and nostalgia, the sound of sizzling a melody of home. Eaten plain, dusted with sugar, or drizzled with syrup, they were loved by both children and grown folk alike. For the Amish, fritters were a celebration of harvest, a way to honor the land's bounty while wasting nothing. Whether served at breakfast or as a side for supper, they brought sunshine to every plate. In each bite was the taste of simplicity perfected, proof that happiness could be fried up from what grew just outside the door. Number 15. Tomato gravy on biscuits. Bacon drippings in the skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred in until it browned, then a can of crushed tomatoes poured over the roux. Salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar, poured over fresh biscuits still hot from the oven. In the farming communities of eastern Tennessee and the Piedmont counties of North Carolina, tomato gravy was breakfast on the days the salt pork ran out. It was also supper on the days a new supply hadn't arrived yet. A can of tomatoes was 11 cents. A bag of self-rising flour was 20 cents and made biscuits for a full week. A woman named Loretta Hensley raised 7 children on a tenant farm outside Morristown, Tennessee in the early 1950s. She made tomato gravy every Monday morning after the weekend had used up the meat. Her children thought Monday breakfast was the best meal of the week. She let them believe it. That was the kind of quiet generosity those women were capable of. Reused pickle juice marinade might sound odd today, but back then it was a beloved trick that saved both money and flavor. When a jar of pickles was finished, the brine left behind was never poured down the drain. Instead, frugal home cooks would use it to marinate meats, soak onions, dress potato salads, or even brighten up beans. The vinegar and spices acted like an instant flavor booster, turning bland ingredients into something tangy, zippy, and unexpectedly delicious. Pickle brine also tenderized cheaper cuts of meat, making it a go-to solution for tougher steaks or leftover roast. In fact, the practice was so widespread that old cookbooks listed pickle juice right alongside salt and pepper in many recipes. Some even recommended saving different types of brine, dill, sweet, or hot, and matching them to particular dishes. It was all part of the waste-nothing attitude of the time. Even if your pantry was nearly empty, you could make dinner feel interesting again with nothing more than a splash of what was left in the pickle jar. It's proof that creativity doesn't need fancy ingredients, just a good memory, a bit of vinegar, and a whole lot of heart. Fried cornmeal mush was the meal that never failed, whether for breakfast or supper. Yesterday's cornmeal porridge was poured into pans, chilled, and sliced thick before hitting the skillet. The butter hissed as each piece browned to a golden crust, the inside soft and creamy as pudding. It was the kind of food that tasted better the second time around, sweetened with syrup or served beside fried eggs. For the Amish, it was a dish of virtue, simple, frugal, and satisfying. It made the most of what you had and wasted nothing. Each bite tasted like comfort, like home after a long day. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that even the plainest food could be a masterpiece in the right hands. Oatmeal meatloaf binder might not sound glamorous, but it was one of the most dependable cooking tricks of the era. When breadcrumbs were in short supply, or when a cook just needed something heartier, rolled oats stepped up to the plate. Mixed into ground beef or pork with eggs and spices, oats gave structure to meatloaf, absorbed flavor, and made every bite stretch just a little farther. They were cheap, shelf-stable, and widely available, even during hard times. And unlike bread, they didn't dry out the mixture. Instead, they kept everything moist while adding fiber and body. Depression-era and wartime cookbooks praised oatmeal not only for its price but for its versatility, showing up in main courses as often as in breakfast. Some recipes even suggested soaking the oats in milk before mixing them in for an extra soft texture. For big families trying to feed everyone on a budget, swapping breadcrumbs for oats became second nature. No one cared that it wasn't gourmet. They were just glad to have a warm, filling slice of something savory. And with ketchup on top and mashed potatoes on the side, meatloaf night became a cozy, familiar ritual in homes across the country. Amish friendship bread was more than just bread. It was a bond, a passing of kindness from one home to another. It started with a simple starter, a bubbling mix of flour, sugar, and milk that was fed and shared over time. When a neighbor handed you a jar of starter, they were giving more than dough. They were offering connection. Every loaf baked from it carried the warmth of community, its scent filling kitchens with cinnamon, vanilla, and comfort. It stretched through generations, each recipe a little different, but equally filled with care. You could taste the patience, the faith, and the friendship in every slice. It was never about perfection. It was about people, about sharing abundance even when there was little to spare. In that way, friendship bread was not just a recipe. It was a legacy of generosity, one rising loaf at a time. One-crust vegetable pie was a budget-saving marvel hiding in plain sight. In the pages of countless Depression-era and wartime cookbooks, you'd find this clever suggestion: skip the top crust. Why? Because flour, lard, and butter were rationed, and a double crust was considered an unnecessary luxury. Instead, home cooks would pour a simple vegetable filling, often made from onions, carrots, potatoes, or cabbage, into a single pie shell and bake it until golden. These pies weren't flashy, but they were hearty, reliable, and warm. The single crust cut costs in half while still delivering the texture and comfort people craved. Occasionally, if a family had a little meat on hand, they'd chop it finely and mix it into the filling to boost the flavor and stretch it further. Cheese, if available, might go on top. But most often, it was just vegetables, a thickened sauce, and that humble base of baked dough. It was more than enough. The one-crust pie reflected the kind of frugality that didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like smart, resourceful living. For people managing rations and rising prices, it offered something surprisingly rich, the feeling that dinner was still something to look forward to. Egg noodles from scratch were the soul of Amish cooking. Humble, handmade, and endlessly useful. Just eggs, flour, and salt were kneaded into a firm dough, rolled out thin and cut with care. The strands dried on wooden racks or towel-lined tables, catching sunlight from kitchen windows. They boiled quickly, filling the room with the scent of simplicity. Served with butter, gravy, or tossed into soups, they were as dependable as they were delicious. Making noodles by hand was a lesson in patience and pride. Every roll, every cut a quiet prayer for nourishment. No machines, no shortcuts, just steady work and faith in the result. Egg noodles were not just food. They were tradition, spun by hand and shared with love. Creamed, canned corn with a flour slurry was one of those dishes that made something ordinary feel just a little indulgent. The idea was to take a can of corn, cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, and give it a makeover. You'd pour the corn, liquid and all, into a saucepan and stir in a quick mix of water and flour. As it simmered, the slurry thickened the liquid into a creamy, starchy sauce that hugged every kernel. Some recipes suggested a splash of milk or a dab of margarine if you had it. But even without those, the final result was comforting. It mimicked the texture of creamed corn without needing fresh cream or butter, two things that were either rationed or too expensive for many homes. This little side dish showed up at dinner tables next to meatloaf, fried potatoes, or bean patties, giving the meal a creamy contrast and helping to fill plates without much cost. It's a great example of how far a single can and a spoonful of flour could go. Cookbooks promoted this trick for its thrift, but people remembered it because it worked. Simple, smart, and warm. What more could you ask for? She used to say, make do or do without. Soak a bag of pintos overnight, bake a slice of pone in a heavy iron pan, Pull up a chair away from the television and crumble that pone right into the bowl. Drop a comment below and tell us which one your own grandmother kept on the stove all day. The supermarket stopped stocking the cuts that built these meals, and the country store closed when the interstate came through, but the recipes went into hands and hands passed them on. These were the meals that kept your family alive, and they are still cheap and still full and still here for anybody willing to soak the beans the night before.